the Honourable Dr. Craig Emerson. Dr. Emerson was born in Barradine in rural New South Wales and educated at St Patrick's College, Strathfield in Sydney. He holds a Bachelor of Economics Honours degree from the University of Sydney, a Master of Economics degree from the University of Sydney and a PhD in Economics from the Australian National University. He's also been a postdoctoral fellow at the Australian National University and has around 20 publications to his name. In the past, Dr. Emerson has variously been an economic analyst with the United Nations, an economic advisor to the Minister for Resources and Energy and Minister for Finance, an Assistant Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, an economic and environmental advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke. He became Director General of the Queensland Department of the Environment in 1990 and was Chief Executive Officer of the South East Queensland Transit Authority from 1995 to 1996. He was elected to Parliament in 1998 and after the 2010 election was appointed Minister for Trade. His portfolio was expanded to include competitiveness in early 2012. Prior to that, he had portfolio responsibilities for small business, competition policy, consumer affairs and deregulation. Dr. Emerson's other interests include rugby union and rugby league, and he's a great fan of the music of the 1970s rock band Skyhooks, especially their hit Horror Movie. I feel sure Dr. Emerson's insights into future Australian trade policy, and particularly its impacts on agriculture, will be of enormous interest to everyone here today. So please welcome Dr. Craig Emerson.
Well, thanks for that warm and comprehensive welcome. I did come from Barradine in northwest New South Wales in 1970, but to pick up the theme, I'm not living in the 70s. I haven't got another disease, not the right day, got the wrong week. I'm just afraid of being called a freak, and that won't happen here today, I'm sure. So the task that I've been given is to talk about whether China and Asia are the future for Australian agriculture, and I'd put it to you that the answer is yes. A bit of a historic context before I get into the present and the future. Agriculture here in Australia has been a very efficient enterprise for the best part of 200 years, and we've argued long and hard, and with some success, for the opening of agricultural markets around the world. We did that vigorously during the 1980s with the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations, where I was able to be present when John Dawkins formed the Cairns Group of Fair Trading Nations at Port Douglas, or just outside of Cairns it actually was, in 1986. And at that time the outlook for agriculture was very bleak indeed. The reason fundamentally was that we had the operation of both the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe and of course the Farm Act in the United States, then supported and augmented by an export enhancement program. The net effect of all of that was to drive agricultural prices down, and farmers were doing it very, very tough. So that's why we took such an aggressive stand in the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations, and for the first time agriculture was put on the agenda. I'm not pretending that enormous progress was made, but certainly the world understood that it was vitally important that agricultural trade barriers and subsidies be lowered and, where possible, removed. But it was a pretty tough time for Australian farmers. But if we fast forward, given that we did foresee the Asian century through the engagement that Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and others, and afterwards John Howard had with the region, with China, particularly in Bob's case, Indonesia in Paul's case, we did foresee the Asian century, and we wanted to be part of it, and that's why we now have released the Asian Century White Paper, because we did believe that this would be the region which would provide a real boost to agricultural production and incomes here in Australia. If you look at 2008, when there were food price spikes around the world that actually led to riots in a diverse array of countries from Africa through to the Caribbean, you can see the impact of high food prices on consumers in those countries. They get very restless and in fact have a disposition to overthrow government. So governments themselves become very sensitive to rising food prices, but that is the outlook for food prices for the next couple of decades. I'm not talking about next year, I'm talking about the next couple of decades, and the reason is pretty straightforward. There are 7 billion people on Earth now. The 7 billionth was born last year, and by 2050 certainly there will be 9.3 billion people. Of those 7 billion people, 1 billion go to bed hungry every night. So we're going to have a big increase in population globally, and much of that focused in our own region. But there's a second shift, not just the population rise, and that is the middle classes of Asia. By the end of this decade, the economies of Asia will be bigger than the combined economies of Europe and North America. And by 2030, there will be 3 billion people in Asia who have entered into the middle class. So as they do that, their tastes will change in favour of higher quality, higher protein food sources, and how well are we placed to meet that demand, because when we're talking about high protein, we're talking about a shift from grain consumption, whether it be rice or wheat, barley, but into various meats. Obviously they include beef and sheep meat, as well as chicken, pork, and also fish. But I think this offers a fantastic opportunity for Australian agriculture, and this is what we have highlighted in the white paper, that here is literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to shift agriculture from what has been regarded as old economy, a well-established industry using well-established practices, to a new economy, being top of the pops, right out in front as a great producer of food for these rising Asian markets. Now, we know pretty much how to do this because, as was explained in the introduction, various innovations have been adopted over the years to ensure that we get greater productivity out of our agriculture. We probably don't have a lot of unutilised agricultural land in Australia, but arguably, given the capacity to lift our productivity, we can get a lot more agricultural produce out of the land that is here in Australia, and there are vast quantities of that. So when we look at the countries in the region, such as China and Indonesia, those two big countries, for the reasons that I set out, do have policies, stated policies of self-sufficiency. But in truth, self-sufficiency and food security are not the same thing. Self-sufficiency can't be achieved in a number of these countries across the full range of agricultural products, because if you move to achieve self-sufficiency, for example, in grains in China, which is a preoccupation, then you're foreclosing on the possibility of achieving self-sufficiency in beef, because grains and beef probably compete for the same land, or if you're looking at intensive beef production through feedlots, what do the cattle eat? Grains. So our argument to these countries, including to Indonesia, is you might drive for self-sufficiency in the staples, and we can understand, we don't necessarily agree with it, but we can understand why you would want to do that for stability and political purposes, and to try to keep prices down and supplies up in those. But the more you do that, the more you're basically foreclosing on self-sufficiency in other products to which they might aspire but won't actually achieve it. So we argue that in place of self-sufficiency, they should be actually seeking food security. Now, Australia has been, over the last quarter century, a very reliable supplier of minerals and energy in meeting the minerals and energy security needs of the region. That is, we've produced here and sold there, and we've had investment here from those countries to sell into those markets. We believe the same model should apply in relation to agricultural products, and especially those higher protein sources. So that's our argument or offer to the countries in the region. But we do confront, as has been said in the introduction, trade barriers across each of those countries. And I want to take you through how we are seeking to get those trade barriers down. Fundamentally, we keep negotiating. We do it every day. We look for new ways to achieve breakthroughs. But it isn't, at this point in time, the greatest time for trade liberalisation. If you look at what's going on in Geneva, and I've just returned 2 weeks ago from Geneva to try to fire the joint up a bit and enthuse the place, there's a dozen or more reasons why they can say no and very few reasons why they say yes. There are some signs of progress at last in Geneva, and the NFF actually, through Jock Laurie, accompanied me on that trip. But it still will take some time. But the point I'm making is, with a slow global economic growth overall, there's this sense of wanting to protect markets rather than to open them. In that context, we have continued to negotiate with Korea. There is a problem with the investor-state dispute settlement issue that Korea has raised relatively late in the piece when we were looking like we could complete. Korea has asked for investor-state dispute provisions which would allow Korean companies to take the Australian government to court if they thought that they were being disadvantaged or something was happening in contravention of the free trade agreement. We don't support investor-state dispute settlement provisions, and indeed the Howard government, in the negotiations it undertook with the United States in 2005, said no to those, and in lieu of investor-state dispute settlement provisions, the Foreign Investment Review Board threshold was increased from $244 million to over $1 billion for United States investment in Australia. Korea wants the $1 billion threshold and investor-state dispute settlement provisions, and we've never given it to the United States. The previous government never gave it to the United States, and we don't propose to give it to Korea, quite frankly. So that's why it's blocked. But we can't just subjugate, national government policy on that issue, given that previous governments haven't, and we don't see the funny side of being taken to court by, for example, American tobacco companies on plain packaging of cigarettes. We were close until this became a real problem. Our Prime Minister and the President of Korea have met again recently, and they have resolved again to complete the negotiations quickly. So then it'll be up to me and Professor Bark, who is the Trade Minister and an academic, and he's a good guy, but we are in a world where there is, or in a country where there is in fact a presidential election on, and they're basically in caretaker mode. So we'll be dealing either with the President during the last months of his presidency, or with a new President, because he can't run again. So that's the situation in Korea. They have wanted to give us not quite the same deal that they gave the US on beef, that is the phasing out of tariffs over 18 years for us instead of 15 years for the United States. And we've worked with the industry where we do have a proposition where we'd accept that, but that we would want the gap between the Australian tariff and the US tariff not to get too wide. So they're the only two remaining issues. With Indonesia, you said in the introduction that there'd been a reduction in imports as a result of the suspension of live cattle. That's actually not true. The reduction has been underway for about 4 years now, and it continues. But I had hosted the Trade Minister Gita Wirawan out here about a month ago, and he was asked this question, will there be further reductions? Do you see further reductions in Indonesian demand for Australian beef? He said no, he sees an increase in demand for Australian beef. And I see David Farley's here and a number of others who are very familiar with the Trade Minister's plans for Indonesia, which are to increase Indonesian total beef consumption very substantially from perhaps 2 kilograms a year on average to 20 kilograms a year on average, and that would mean more beef consumption and therefore more beef production for all. So we are working through the Indonesian system and including on the possibilities of investment in Indonesia and investment in Australia to see if we can get a liberalisation there. The system in Indonesia is not quite as familiar as it is here in Australia. Different ministries have their own authority, if you like, and so we have to seek to negotiate with those different ministries. In relation to China, it's true that that negotiation has been going since 2005. The Chinese come to us from time to time and say they'd like to rev up the negotiations. We're always keen to do that. What we've been seeking with China on agriculture is a package similar to that was given to New Zealand. And that would substantially improve market access for our various agricultural producers into China. So it's a bit of a hot and cold sort of situation, which we find with a number of the other countries. That China's transition will be completed tomorrow on my birthday. That was very considerate of them to put that to coincide with my birthday. And we'll see with the new Chinese leadership, I think, greater authority for others to make decisions, because they'll see their new leaders and hopefully they'll be in a position to effect some of the very good intentions that the Chinese have expressed to us. Which brings me to the final and fundamental point. We can have an Australian government or American government or a New Zealand government pushing against doors and asking countries to reduce their tariffs. And we're, I guess, outsiders using our diplomatic efforts, our friendships, moral suasion as much as we can. And that really does have an influence, but I think of even greater influence is to have joint venture partnerships with countries in these regions, because inside, behind the tariff walls, behind the other trade barriers, you've got advocates every day in there saying, why do we have to face artificially high costs in bringing these products into our country? And that's why I'm a great fan of a partnership model. And again, we've talked about that in relation to Indonesia, where at the political level, at the individual parliamentary level, we're seen more as friends than adversaries. And similarly in China, they have had this historic view that New Zealand's a little farm and therefore was a little threat, and Australia's a big farm and is a big threat. Well, how about we try to remove this sense of threat and change it to a sense of opportunity through joint venture arrangements in both countries? And so that's the model that we're seeking to pursue. You may be aware that we've done an agricultural study jointly with China. We're still waiting for them to give final approval to that report. But essentially it will say, yes, there is a role for Chinese investment in Australia, not necessarily coming in and buying up the farm, certainly not buying up the farm and dedicating the production for China and bringing in cheap labour and, you know, starving our people and some of the more crazy suggestions that have been made. But maybe investment in infrastructure, maybe minority positions as state-owned enterprises invest in some of our agricultural companies. We already know that some of our biggest pastoral and agribusinesses have got substantial, if not majority, foreign ownership. But if we're going to meet this great food production task, the defining issue of the first half of the 21st century, we will need more investment. We just can't do it without more investment. And of course that will involve more Australian investment. It'll involve more investment by superannuation funds. Great. But if we limit it to that, we're limiting ourselves. And we're limiting our ability to achieve, I think, for Australia, a great outcome, which is going back to from where I came, Barradine, a little town, used to have 900 people, got about 400 now. Barradine could be great again. You know, it could be a great big 900-person town, but they'd be very happy with that. They'd be very happy with that. So here is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for market-driven regional development in Australia, where our towns, our country towns, and our regional centres can be revived. Some of the regional centres are going quite well. A lot of the country towns aren't. But everyone's talked about decentralisation and regional development in this country. Here, in the Asian century, it beckons. So let's seize that opportunity. I think we owe that to our rural community and to all those young people who aspire to get a job, work on a farm and work in the production and indeed the processing of agricultural produce here in Australia. Thanks very much.